Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of what is a very busy time of the year for you as you prepare for the return of our students next week. I'm Mike Mills, Vice President of the Office of E-Learning, Innovation, and Teaching Excellence, and I just want to welcome you to this keynote speaker on trauma-aware teaching. Karen Costa is a faculty development facilitator specializing in online pedagogy and trauma-aware higher education. Karen loves leading faculty learners through fun, interactive, and supportive professional development experiences. Karen's first book, 99 Tips for Creating Simple and Sustainable Educational Videos, focuses on helping faculty and teachers to make creative use of videos in their classrooms. Karen is involved in various faculty development initiatives, including as a facilitator for the Online Learning Consortium, Online Learning Toolkit, and Lumen Learning. She spent 4 years as a regular writer for Women in Higher Education. Her writing has also appeared in Inside Higher Education, the Philadelphia Inquirer, On Being, and Faculty Focus. And I would invite you to follow Karen on both Twitter and LinkedIn. Just a ton of resources that are shared in both environments. You will not be disappointed, believe me. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Karen Costa. Karen, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you everyone for being here. I've been looking forward to this pretty much all summer. Summer flew by. I don't know about y'all. My summer didn't quite go as planned. A vacation turned into a staycation. We live in interesting times, don't we? But I've been looking forward to this and having this important conversation with all of you. Take a look at the welcome slide. And just a reminder, you are muted right now. Everybody's muted except for me. You will have a chance to come off mute when we have a question period. Cameras are certainly encouraged. Love to see you. They are absolutely optional. I'm going to remind you of this repeatedly. The chat is open and it's a great way for you to engage, and it engages me as well. I do like to have the chat open. Not everybody does when they facilitate, but I love seeing your comments and questions throughout, and then we'll have special time for questions at the end. So Mike went through some of this already, so I'm not going to belabor any of my story here, but there's, a couple details I want to mention. While I'm doing this, if you haven't already, please say hi in the chat. If you want to perhaps share what you teach, how you're doing today, how you're feeling today, would be wonderful to see that. One of the things I'll mention is that there's a huge growth in the amount of content being shared around this trauma awareness topic, and which I think is fantastic. And I think it's important to be mindful of who we're learning from, perhaps be curious about their expertise. So I'm going to mention this again repeatedly today. I am not a psychologist, psychiatrist. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a counselor. My background is in education, and I have additional trainings and expertise in trauma content. So I weave those together to meet you here as a fellow educator, talking about how trauma shows up in our classrooms, in ourselves and in our students. You can follow me, as Mike mentioned, on Twitter. I'm trying to be a little bit more mindful about not spending too much time there. And you can certainly connect with me via my website, 100 Faculty. And if anybody has any solutions to the current Red Sox situation, you'll see there that I'm seeking help with that. Okay. Wonderful seeing you all. Say hello in the chat. Keep it up. Love seeing that active chat. So before we get too much further today, I want to remind you, we're going to be talking about trauma. And I am mindful of not including any sort of graphic content in this conversation, but we are going to be having a conversation about the tough stuff, about the hard things in life. So please take care of yourselves. If you need to take a break, if you need to watch the recording instead of being here live, trust yourself and listen to those feelings. That's something I'm working on doing as well. I've given you a link here in the speaker's notes of the slides, which I'm going to post again in the chat if you're looking for those, to the SAMHSA mental health resources. This is a great resource you can share with students. SAMHSA stands for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. I am really trying to get the word out that I think we need to get better at practicing mental health preparedness. So having a plan in place for what we're going to do if we encounter a mental health crisis in ourselves, in our students, in our families. Because when those crises hit, it's often tough to reach out for help. So knowing if this happens, if I have a mental health crisis, how am I going to move forward? How am I going to get help? It's really important, I think, to put that in place before that hits. And that's something we can start doing with ourselves, in our families, with our colleagues, and with our students. Oh, I love seeing the Rebecca. That's great. Rebecca's giving a little shout out to SAMHSA here. Okay. So again, you've heard me mention, I want to see you using the chat. And there's lots of ways to engage today. So I like to share this slide, and please feel free to borrow this slide if you teach in Zoom or Teams or whatnot. I think it's really important that we explain to our learners how we want them to engage, rather than just they come into the space and we start talking at them, right? So whether this is a meeting that you're hosting or a workshop or a course, I think it's important to have that conversation. So there's lots of ways for you to engage today. A few would be chat, maybe just reflecting, maybe you want to take notes, perhaps you're going to save questions for the Q&A. But I really encourage and long for you to be engaged with me. This is our workshop, not my workshop. Okay, speaking of which, a chat check-in. So I want to invite you all into the chat. This is a mantra or an idea that I've been working with this summer, my summer that didn't go as planned. If anybody else had one of those, you can relate. And one of the things that I've been saying to myself and using is first things first. And I'll share with you one of my first things that I've been really prioritizing is sleep. So I want to invite you in the chat. What are some of your first things that you do to take care of yourself? What do you do to stay healthy and well? If for me, a first thing is like, if I do this thing, the rest of the day will sort itself out. As long as I do this thing, I know I'm doing, I know I'm taking care of myself. I'll let everything else figure itself out. Love this. Okay, so I've got a fellow sleep prioritizer, gratitude list, walking, moving, a leisurely breakfast, running, meditation, devotional time. Look at this list. Look at this list, folks. So if we did nothing else together today, but share this list and maybe jot down our own first things and maybe one additional first thing that we can learn from a friend, we'd be in good shape. Okay. And we're going to come back to this. I love these recommendations. Whoever said cat, yes. My dog is probably listening in and he's saying, I thought I was your first thing. First things first for me is about putting those wellness things that we know we need to do first and protecting them at all costs. For me, it's sleep. I will recommend a book I read this summer called The Anatomy of Anxiety, and it's written by a holistic psychiatrist. And she talks about the importance of sleep and how to protect it. I spent, I think, $80 on room darkening shades, and they have been, it's not perfect, but they've been really helpful, right? A simple thing I was able to do to take care of myself and put first things first. Love, love, love what you had to share. So a little pull back the curtain moment. This is something you can do with your students, right? Just like you might share with them how they can engage with you in a classroom. That's a trauma-aware teaching practice. Starting your course or your meeting by checking in with people. There's a lot of variations of these sort of chat check-in questions, asking people and encouraging them to take care of themselves. Okay, here's our agenda-ish. It's 2022, so I feel the need to add the ish, right? We're gonna try to stick to this, but who knows what life will bring us. Knock on wood, we'll stick to the plan. We're gonna go over some models and definitions of trauma. We're gonna then talk about trauma's impacts on learning. I'm going to introduce you to the 6 principles of trauma-informed teaching, which is modeled off of, some of you might be familiar with the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. Most of us, I'm assuming though, are not clinicians or counselors or mental health folks. We are educators. So we're going to look at this from a pedagogical standpoint. And if you are one of those things, we love you and we need you here. We're so happy that you're going to share that expertise, but we're going to focus on that pedagogical edge, that pedagogical viewpoint. And then we've got 30 minutes for optional Q&A. It's sort of an ask me anything. So if you want to ask me about wellness practices or online pedagogy or trauma-aware teaching or challenges you're coming up with, or you just want to share what's going on and the challenges you're facing, we'll have 30 minutes to do that together. Okay, so let's get into some models and definitions. The first one that I think it's important to point out, and that I've mentioned a couple times, but this is not what we're going to do today, is that healthcare clinical model of trauma. And a lot of this is guided by the DSM, which is, I always have to look at my notes, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which many people view as an incredibly helpful tool. It's not without controversy. And it is one of the main tools used by healthcare providers. Folks often have that word psych in their title, psychiatrist or psychologist. The healthcare clinical model of trauma. We're not going to be diving into that today. Another important model of trauma is what I call it trauma innovations. So we're seeing now that trauma is becoming more mainstream. There's more curiosity, more conversation about it. So we're seeing a ton of content, for example, being shared on social media. Again, we want to be mindful who we learn from. I think it's great that it's being shared in that space, and we want to be mindful. Tools like EMDR. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It is a treatment for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're seeing some really innovative stuff. A lot of talk now about using psychedelics to treat trauma. Tons of support there and evidence that that is a really, really hopeful thing to treat long-term trauma. So the innovations field, we're not going to dive too much into that. Here's where we're going to focus. We're going to focus on trauma-aware teaching. So we're going to take that pedagogical focus. Everything we talk about today is going to be grounded in what I call mutualism, which is the idea that we want to seek spaces that benefit us as educators and humans and our students. Trauma-aware teaching is not about self-sacrifice, folks, okay? Notice the question I started with. How are you taking care of yourself? Trauma-aware teaching is not about self-sacrifice. How can we find spaces that benefit us and our students? This is a new and evolving field. About a year before the pandemic, a group of trauma folks working in higher education and I got together, and we were going to write a book about this topic because there wasn't one. There was not a book about trauma-aware teaching in higher education as recently as whatever year that was, 2019. There's a book coming out this month called Trauma-Informed Pedagogies, which is focused on that topic. It's really one of the few that's out there about trauma-aware teaching in higher education, and it just came out this month. So this is really a new and evolving field. That said, you all have been doing this, many of you for decades, right? Many of you have been doing, you might not have called it this, but you, especially folks who are working in the community college space, have been doing this work for years, if not decades. Okay, so again, I want to invite into the chat. If you aren't there yet, you can pull up the chat on your screen in your Zoom. And let's go ahead. We're going to work on some definitions. Go ahead and tell me, how would you define trauma in the chat? Could be a word, a phrase, not graded, ungraded. No grades given out here. Yeah, death is certainly one of the most extreme examples of a trauma, certainly. What do other folks think? How would you define trauma? Feeling immunized, change to whatever is your normal, life interrupting, shakes person to their core, distressing, paralyzing. Yeah, unexpected defeat. Okay, wonderful. So if you haven't shared your definition yet, please keep doing so. Another pull back the curtain moment. I'm now going to share some definitions of trauma with you. Notice that I asked you for yours first. This is one of my favorite teaching strategies. It's called activating prior knowledge. I'm sure many of you do this. If, one of the simplest teaching strategies, ask learners what they know before you tell them what you know. That will get those neurons firing in the brain, and that will make the information you then share with them more likely to stick. Okay. So here's something I think is a big misunderstanding or misconception or an opportunity to share with folks around trauma. So the word trauma is really referring to the harmful incident or the conditions, right? So a harmful incident, for example, could be a car accident, an incident. Conditions could be growing up in a home with child abuse or neglect. Okay, incident or conditions. That is what we often mean when we talk about trauma. The trauma response, which in some ways is really what we're talking about today, are the changes that happen in our minds and brains and body that result from that trauma. Okay, they result from the harmful incident. And these changes happen because that trauma, that incident or set of conditions is so overwhelming that we're not able to process it all. So our brains in survival mode, which is what we want them to, we want to survive. It's why we're still here, sort of push away or push down or separate that part of that trauma that we're not able to process. So we become overwhelmed by this incident. Our brains make these sort of unconscious decisions to protect us, and we push down or push away those overwhelming feelings. One of the things you'll hear in the literature about that process is called the wall. So the idea is that we push anything that's too overwhelming behind that wall. So a really important concept in this idea of the trauma response is the overwhelm of our ability to process something. We go beyond that processing ability. We all have different processing abilities, and that trauma exceeds it. So I mentioned some examples before. A set of conditions, for example, might be child abuse or neglect, natural disasters. COVID has been classified as a natural disaster, so global pandemics are certainly examples of traumas. That does not mean that all folks who are exposed to these traumas will develop that trauma response, right? But the potential is there. Racism is an example of a type of trauma, a set of conditions that leads to these predictable changes in the brain. Climate change, we're seeing a ton of data coming out about climate grief and climate anxiety. Those are things that we need to be thinking about and helping people manage those predictable responses that they're experiencing. So here's another definition of trauma for you. This comes from SAMHSA. So the previous definition was me. This definition is SAMHSA. Again, that's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And I've underlined a couple of key points here. So I'm going to take a breath and let you look this over for a second, see what you might notice about it. Okay, so a trauma, as defined by SAMHSA, is an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual. That's important. We'll come back to that. As physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on that individual in a variety of ways. Couple important things. Experienced by an individual means that what you are able to process and does not elicit a trauma response from you, that might not be true for me. Perhaps I'm not able to process it and it does elicit a trauma response for me, right? So this is highly variable across individuals. And the other thing that's important to note here is that a trauma can be harmful or life-threatening and lead to those trauma responses. So it does not need to be life-threatening for us to see those predictable changes in the brain and the mind and the body. Okay, so that's there's tons of definitions of this, folks. I'm giving you two. Okay, there's tons of definitions, but I'm giving you two. Okay, so a Q&A. I want to invite you back into the chat. Question 1, that's a yes or no. So you can share in the chat. Does all trauma result in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? And then question 2, what do you think the prevalence of PTSD is in the adult population? And the most recent data I've been able to get my hands on, I'm going to share some post-COVID data with you, but in the general population, the data is pre-COVID. Okay, so I'm seeing lots of no's, and I'm seeing, let's see, a 15, 25, 50, 40, 25. It's interesting. I've been doing this workshop for a while now, and the longer I do it, the more that number goes up that people guess. I think that's because there's a growing awareness of trauma. So again, if you don't have the slides, there is a lot of data in the speaker's notes for the slides. Generally speaking, when public health folks who have done studies, CDC, of the rates of PTSD in the population, 7 to 12%. So I'm really glad we're clarifying that, because what I want to emphasize here is PTSD is, it's not rare, but it is not, all trauma is not resulting in PTSD. PTSD is a very complex, also very treatable condition that typically results from life-threatening traumas. Okay, it's in the DSM, that psychological diagnosis book I mentioned earlier. But the vast majority of trauma responses do not rise to the level of that PTSD diagnosis and are not resulting in that more severe, complex changes in the brain that we see with PTSD. So that's, I think a lot of folks who are, perhaps a little nervous about getting to know about trauma and how they can use it in the classrooms, make an assumption that everybody who has these experiences has PTSD, and PTSD, that term scares folks a little bit. So, perhaps that's a little reassuring that we're talking about, generally speaking, 7 to 12%. The other piece of data I'll share with you, and again, this is in the speaker's notes, we are seeing an increase in this during the pandemic. So one study I found to share with you all is that survivors of severe COVID, we're seeing rates of 16 to 25%. So almost double in that population. Again, this is a treatable condition. So if folks are, thinking they're experiencing this, this is absolutely a treatable condition. But again, most trauma does not rise to the level of PTSD. So that's important to know. Another term that I want to help you folks put into your teaching toolbox and your trauma-aware teaching toolbox is the word resilience. We've heard this word a lot in the past couple of years, right? So let's talk about what it actually means. In the trauma literature, resilience is defined as a return to the pre-trauma level of functioning, okay? It is a return to where you were before. So because of those trauma responses, functioning in one's daily life has decreased or has been lost or has been challenged. And resilience is the idea that with support, we can return to that pre-trauma level of functioning. It is obviously influenced by things like genetics, environment, and one's relative privilege, which is directly connected to our ability to access care, right? My definition of resilience is our inherent ability to heal in the light of correct care. So we often hear this phrase, be resilient, and I've got it crossed out here on the slide. And we're misusing the term, right? So telling somebody to be resilient isn't really how it works. It's not something we can just turn on. It's not a light switch, right? When we receive correct care and support for those trauma responses, our natural healing capabilities do kick in, and we can absolutely return to those pre-trauma levels of functioning. But it's not appropriate to use that term, be resilient, or to tell people to be resilient. Rather, what we can do is we can focus on providing support and access to correct care. What do I mean by correct care? Getting people to the support they need. One of the examples I use is a few years ago, I had a concussion and I wasn't getting better. And I was seeing my GP, I was seeing a general neurologist, wasn't getting better. I went to a concussion center. I knew I was in the right place because there were pictures of, I live in Massachusetts, all of the New England sports players on the wall of this concussion center. The guy who ran it was like one of the top folks. I immediately started to improve because I received correct care and got the treatment that I needed. Okay, so let's not tell folks to be resilient. Let's give folks support and access to correct care, and that will help that natural resilience bloom. Okay, so we're going to shift a bit here to traumas. We now know what trauma is, and we know some examples of how that's going to show up. And we know what resilience is. We know the definition of PTSD. Let's focus now on how trauma is going to show up in terms of learning. So I want to invite you into the chat. And this is a true or false, and I'm going to take a sip of water. trauma changes our brains. I have a break. Emily's going to challenge me a little bit and say it depends. So I love that. I see a lot of truths. Okay. So this one's true. The trauma response results in predictable changes to our brains. I want to share some other things that change our brains. This workshop is changing your brain. The experience of living through a global pandemic is changing our brain. Exercise changes our brain. I saw a lot of people talking about walking, getting outdoors, changes our brain. Hugging our loved ones changes our brain. Meditation, tons of very interesting stuff about what meditation does to the brain. We absolutely see changes in the brain. All kinds, right? Our brains are constantly changing. So yes, trauma changes our brain. I'm hearing a lot of people starting to talk about that, which is great. I think that can sound a little scary, right? Those people over there with trauma whose brains have been changed. Our brains are in a constant state of flux. All of our brains are changing in good ways and in challenging ways. So let's talk a little bit about that. What do we mean when we talk about brain change? The term in the neuroscience field is called neuroplasticity. And I had a little moment this summer where when I was taking a little break, where I realized I want to do more work sharing this concept with educators in a way that's really simple and straightforward. So neuroplasticity, I define it as the inherent ability of our brain to change throughout the lifespan in response to both positive and negative conditions. I gave a lot of examples of what might change the brain earlier. So when we talk about neuroplasticity, we often talk about functional. So that's like communication between different brain systems. That's what we mean when we talk about functional. Structural. So that's, actual brain structures, getting bigger, getting smaller. There's a fascinating study of London taxi drivers where the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain, in memorizing the streets of London, that part of the brain got much bigger than the typical person. And chemical changes are also happening in our brain constantly. So you might have heard of some, of our famous brain chemicals, dopamine, serotonin. Those are always sort of in this state of flux. And what we are exposed to in our environment and our experiences change our brains on these levels. The short version of neuroplasticity is you can, without a doubt, and I'm holding on to this one. This one feels good. You can teach an old dog new tricks, right? So while there might be certain periods of time when our brains are more sort of ripe for certain experiences, we now know that people can learn things until their last breath, right? So I know many of you work with adult students and have seen this. I used to have students working at a community college coming in their 80s to start courses. Our brains are able to learn, and they are in that state of change throughout our lives. So neuroplasticity is good news. Another way to think about this is brains can't not change. So trauma is certainly changing our brains in predictable ways and brings a host of challenges. But our brains are in a constant state of flux. The good news is that we can make choices about what's going on in our classrooms that help bring neuroplasticity in from a positive standpoint. So learning is brain change. Teachers are brain changers, right? So we can look at this from a positive perspective too. Our brains are changing, nothing to be afraid of, and we can harness it for good. So what do we talk about when we talk about the predictable changes in our brain as a result of these trauma responses? What we know is that stress and trauma redirect our brains away from what are called executive functions, and I'll define those in a minute, and toward survival mode. Okay, this is why we are still here as a species. So this slide is not necessarily bad news. If our brains didn't do this, we would not be here, right? So we want our brains to alert us to threats, and we want our brains, when they are a perceived threat, to put us into survival mode. But in the classroom, that can result in a lot of challenges. So let's talk about these executive function skills. These are the things that start to shut down when we are under prolonged stress or when we are experiencing that trauma response. Tell me, folks, any of these feel like important college success or life success skills? Yes. Yeah, big yes for me. Things like focus, concentration, decision-making, delayed gratification, time management, and prioritizing. These are the foundations on which you are building, you're teaching specific content in your discipline. Exec function skills are the foundation that allow us to dig into that content. These all take a hit and start to shut down when our brains are exposed and experiencing that trauma response. So this is really challenging. And I'm sure many of you are saying, that sounds very familiar to me, right? Do you have a tough time focusing when your child is sick or your pet is sick? This week, last week, I should say, my dog had a little minor surgery and he had stitches. And we got through the surgery. And then I didn't realize that that meant we had to watch him for 10 days so that he wouldn't go at his stitches, which was a whole nother level of challenge. So we had to have our eyes on him because he was not a fan of the comb. About halfway through, I said to my son, let's get out of the house and go for a walk. I got to get out of here. I'm losing it. And we went up to the local track, and I got to the track and I looked down and I was wearing my slippers. And I thought, this is the brain under stress, right? The simple act of putting on a pair of shoes was not on my radar. Now we're talking about bringing students into classes where that was not a higher order thinking skill to take off my slippers and put on my shoes. And my 13-year-old, by the way, was, not too happy to be seen in public with me in my slippers. That was a lower order thinking skill, and it was shut down. Okay. Think about what those, the higher order thinking skills and how trauma and stress might impact them. It really is extremely difficult to go into those spaces when we are focused in survival mode. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about this trauma response and learning. Here are some of the examples. I mentioned sort of the executive function skills. Here are some additional examples of the trauma response. These are predictable changes and shifts in the brain and behavior that we see as a result of exposure to trauma. Some of these might sound familiar to you. Okay, I'm going to give you a second. I'm going to take a sip of water. So things we are seeing and have been seeing pre-COVID. I like to call COVID the great amplifier. The music was playing before COVID turned up the volume. So things like depression and anxiety. Anxiety is the #1 disability on college campuses. Okay. This isn't on our radar. It needs to be. Okay. And it is often, not always, but often a trauma response. So this is really important. Think about your engagement with students and your relationships with students, conversations about, grades with students. Some of the things we see that are trauma responses are irritability, an assumption of aggression. Think about having a conversation with a student about a contentious issue. Don't try to say that 10 times fast. And they have this quote unquote short fuse or a lack of trust. They are in that attunement to threat phase. This is not because they don't like you or they're trying to give you, trying to disrupt your day. These are brain responses, predictable responses in the brain as a result of trauma. So one of the things we see a lot with trauma is that relationships are impacted. I'm telling you this not because every time you see a student who struggles to trust you, you can say, I got to find out what their trauma was, right? So one of my friends says, we don't want to be the trauma police. That's not our job. But I have found that this awareness shifts my relationships with students. When I recognize that perhaps what I'm seeing is not misbehavior or defiance or trying to make me stressed out, that what I might be seeing is stress or trauma behavior. So trauma-aware teaching allows us to get curious. Maybe there's something going on here that I don't understand, right? And I'll tell you what, the older I get, the more I say, there's something going on here that I don't understand, and I can act accordingly, okay? So these are predictable responses that we see that could impact our relationships with students in the classroom. Okay, so I'm going to shift us here into, and I'm going to pull up another share for you. I want to highlight this. I've got another checklist for you. So we're not going to go through every single item on this checklist. I just put it in the chat for y'all. What's in the chat is a trauma-aware teaching checklist using the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. I'm not going to go through every single thing on that checklist, so you can save that for later. Okay. Maybe you can say, maybe you want to save it for next year, right? We're going to prioritize our well-being and put first things first, but you have it now. We're going to go through some of those items. So what are the 6 principles of trauma-informed care? I'm going to go through them one on this slide just quickly, and then we'll dive into each of them more deeply. The first one is safety. And as I'm pulling these up, you might want to allow your brain to show you or to reflect on how you might be using these already, because I know that you are. The second principle is trustworthiness and transparency. The third is peer support. The fourth is collaboration and mutuality. The fifth is empowerment, voice, and choice. And the sixth is, this is the new one, newer. It used to be 5 principles. They added this one in the past few years: cultural, historical, and gender lens. So what we're going to do today, I've taken the 6 principles of trauma informed care, and I've shifted them into a pedagogical approach in line with that trauma-aware teaching piece. So before we dive into those, I want to remind us all that faculty and staff working conditions are student learning conditions. So I hope and will invite you to not see this, these ideas that I'm going to share with you as one more thing that you need to do. I know how much you all have going on. I'm an adjunct myself. I work with faculty all day, every day, lots and lots. And I know how much you all have going on. And I know that you're trying to take care of yourselves and your families and your students and to stay well. I don't want us to look at this list as more stuff for faculty to do. We need to be creating positive, supportive, humane, trauma-aware working conditions for faculty in order to create space for faculty to use these strategies with students, right? So if faculty and staff, for example, don't feel safe, it's more difficult for them to create a sense of safety in the classroom for students. If faculty and staff feel that they don't trust their team, it's more difficult for them to create a trusting environment for their students. So, I share this with y'all, and I know there's administrators here and staff here and folks from a variety of roles at the institution. I just want to invite us to think about creating conditions for success for everybody, Okay, that was my warning. Let's dive into some of these 6 principles. Okay, so here's how I've set up this slide. The first tip I'm going to share is focused on faculty and staff. And it's going to be how you can apply this concept to take care of yourselves. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we can use them for students. And then I'm going to ask you at the end a question about how you're already doing this, because I know that you are. So that's going to be an opportunity for my fellow people who love chatting. It's going to be an opportunity to hop into the chat and share how you're already doing this. Okay, so what do we mean by safety? How are some of the ways that we can apply this trauma-aware teaching concept? So one of the ways is to advocate for educator safety. As a reminder, again, educator working conditions are student learning conditions. So one of the links I've given you is about brave and safe spaces. I've also given you the link in the to that checklist. Again, I'm going to share it just in case there's more details on all of this. How can we create safe learning environments for our educators so that they can create safe learning environments for our students? Another thing we can, now I'm going to shift here. That first one was in blue. Now I'm going to shift and talk about what we can do with our students. Okay. But notice I'm putting educators first here for the foundation. How could you create safety for your students? You could co-create community guidelines with your learners. So how are we going to process content warnings, or sometimes called trigger warnings, as a class? How are we going to handle camera use if you're teaching in Zoom? You noticed how I handled it, which is to say, I would love to see you, and I want you to take care of yourselves. That's my philosophy of camera use. Work through that with your students, right? Hot topics. How are we going to handle discussing hot topics? How are we going to keep each other safe here? You could co-create those community guidelines with your students. Ensuring a clear path for communication of safety concerns. So who do students talk to if they don't feel safe in your classroom? Perhaps the first answer is you. Perhaps there's a second person that you're sharing with them that they can reach out to, right? Maybe for whatever reason, they don't feel comfortable bringing it to you. Making sure that's clear. That could be something we put on our syllabus, right? I mentioned this before. Reflect upon the differences between brave spaces and safe spaces. There's a reading in the speaker's notes from NASPA, Student Affairs Professionals, that talk about how marginalized students often feel like in our attempt to create a safe space, that marginalized students often are not feeling safe, and that we want to create brave spaces where people are speaking up and asserting themselves and having really clear and good boundaries about safety. So that's an interesting read that you might want to dive deeper into. So go ahead and share in the chat. What are some ways you create a sense of safety for yourself and your students? If you have any ideas there, I'm going to take a sip of water. And I'm going to move us along, but y'all have that chat. So if you have an idea for this or a reading, or there's something going on your campus, you know things that I don't know. So I want you to share those. Okay, our next principle is trustworthiness and transparency. So my first tip here is geared toward faculty and staff. And I'm using these terms of investing and divesting more and more. Invest in those you trust and divest from those that you don't, to the extent possible. So we are all in this state, I think, increasingly of nervous system dysregulation, of those executive functions being challenged, of this state of uncertainty about our future. We have to be really savvy about how we're using our time and taking care of ourselves. I hear a lot of folks telling me that they kind of have that feeling of, there's somebody that they are going to, and it feels like kind of banging their head against a brick wall. So I am now focusing on building critical connections with those who I trust, and focusing on that positive and letting that bloom, and divesting a little bit of my time and energy from spaces that aren't healthy, or from people who aren't healthy and supportive. So that's one of the ways I've been thinking about it. I've given you a link in the speaker's notes to many of you are doing this already, what are called humanizing teaching practices or principles. One of my friends, Michelle Pacansky-Brock, is one of the most popular speakers on this topic. She has an amazing infographic, and it talks about things like, Michelle wrote the foreword to my book. It talks about things like creating a video to introduce yourselves or tell a story to your students, using their names, telling a joke, simple things that we can do to bring humanizing into the classroom. Have a plan. I know things are increasingly in a state of chaos, but to the extent possible, I'm probably going to say that again, but I'm going to try not to. Everything I'm sharing with you is to the extent possible, if it's a priority for you, right? Have a plan, stick to the plan, and over communicate if the plan changes. If you have students in your classroom who are experiencing trauma responses or PTSD, a constant state of flux or not being told about changes can bring up a scary feeling, right? It can kind of ramp up that trauma response. So whenever possible, knowing what's coming can be really helpful. Uphold clear and consistent interpersonal boundaries with students. So I am not a counselor. I am not their friend. I am friendly. I am your professor. I am using humanizing principles, and I have super clear boundaries with my students. When sometimes there's an urge when a student is kind of reaching out for that help to cross that boundary and go into that friend territory. And, what we know in the literature is that people who are in that position of authority, what's really soothing and helps that person feel safe is if you uphold that interpersonal boundary rather than cross it. So think about, and if you want to share in the chat, and again, I see you all are sharing and having conversations while I'm going, perfect, you're learning from each other. Think about how you infuse trustworthiness and transparency in the classroom, and go ahead and share that in the chat. Okay, our third trauma-aware teaching principle here is peer support. And I know a lot of you are doing this already. What would this look like for you as an educator? One of the things I'm talking to folks more and more about, and I'm seeing this happen, like I'm really seeing this happen. I'm getting excited about this. We talk a lot in higher education about faculty development. That does not, in my book, equal faculty support. So I think it's really important. I've been part of spaces over the past couple of years where educators could show up and tell the truth about the hard stuff. Nobody's telling them how to teach. Nobody's telling them what they, you need to fill this out or sign this form, or you need to do XYZ in the classroom, or this grant or this accreditation. You can just show up and say, oh my gosh, this is hard. Or, oh my gosh, I had this student who's going through this and I didn't know what to do. Oh my gosh, I feel like I can't fit in all this content because I'm spending a lot more time doing that emotional check-in with my students. Educators need support. So advocate for this on campus, create it yourself, spaces where it's not about development, it's about support. I just shared on LinkedIn, for those of you who want to check me out there, an institution in California hired a faculty, I forget the exact title, I think it was like faculty wellness specialist. And that person's full-time job is to support faculty well-being and support faculty in supporting student well-being. So it's much, of course, those are pedagogical choices, but it's much less focused on teaching strategies and much more focused on well-being and support. I have never seen a job like that in 20 years in higher ed, and I just saw it this week. So we're moving in the right direction, I think. So how can you use this with students? Anybody using tools like Discord or Flipgrid or VoiceThread? If you are, want to share in the chat. Small group discussions, a very simple way to get going with collaboration, but we've got some tech tools. Tim, you just became very popular. Tim is going to help everybody set up a Discord. My 13-year-old taught me this year. No, I'm teasing Tim. We don't want to overload you. Stephanie's using GroupMe. There's some ideas being shared. Get students connected to their peers. If you are using group projects, and I hope you will consider it, I do group projects. I think they're important. We have to learn to work together, right? Make sure you're providing extremely clear structure and guidelines. Remember those relational challenges that we talked about with trauma? Group projects can bring those out, right? So I find that having really clear guidelines can be very helpful. Of course, we're going to connect students to co-curricular supports via our classroom. So one of the things when I taught on site, I used to have the student activities coordinator and folks who were doing that type of work come into the classroom to talk to students. So I have them here, come in. I want to encourage them to do that. So connecting students to those co-curriculars is really important. I see people doing this already in the chat. I don't know about GroupMe, so I'm going to have to look that up because I'm seeing a few people are mentioning that. But think about how you encourage that peer support and connection in your classroom, and go ahead and share that. Okay, we're doing good on time. I've got 9 minutes and we've got 3 left. So number 4. Oh, I'm a huge fan of Padlet, Mike. Don't even get me started. Don't even get me started. Okay, collaboration and mutuality. Collaboration and mutuality. This one might be my favorite. I don't like to play favorites, but this one might be my favorite. So I mentioned this before, this concept of mutualism. Look for spaces, find those spaces, create those spaces, cultivate and support those spaces that benefit you and your learners. So what do I mean by that? I work with a lot, faculty are so creative, right? I worked with a faculty once, she designed this like super cool, like interactive slide deck with trivia. And it was like a scavenger hunt and tour, and her students loved it. And she loved creating it. And I was like, this is great. I'm so happy for you. And she said, yeah, it took me like 8 hours to put it together. It was one lesson for one class. And I said, okay, let's chat about that, right? Like, you know, the goal here, if she did that for every class, that she would just, you know, surrender her life, right? I said, why don't you keep, you know, make it evergreen so you can use it again next term. And that's the one special, that was the one time you're going to do it this term. Maybe next term you make a second one. And then maybe the term after you make a third one, right? There's also something to be said for not doing like the super fun lesson in every class, right? It becomes a novelty. It's something students look forward to. So she was able to be creative and do something awesome for her learners, and also recognize that she wasn't going to go and make another one of those, because that's not good for her or her students to be exhausted and burned out. So look for spaces and try to find that balance to the extent possible, that your teaching choices benefit both you and your learners. I've mentioned this to you, and it's repeatedly about encouraging your chat participation. Students know things, and they know things that we don't know. So whenever I run into a pedagogical problem, or when I'm working with faculty who say, I'm stuck, I'm having this issue, what should I do? A lot of the time, always, the answer is that leads to beautiful answers is ask your students. When I share that with educators, they go, I didn't think about that. And I go, I know, I didn't think about it either. And it often leads to some really interesting perspectives. So creating space in your classes for students to share what they know, I've hopefully modeled that for you here in the chat. Right? I've hopefully centered and celebrated your expertise in the chat as an example of how you can do that with students. I did this earlier a couple times. Activating prior knowledge is an example of this mutuality, and doing it often. So before we're telling students what we know as experts, let's ask them what they know, and then we can build on those wonderful neurons that get fired off when we activate their prior knowledge. I love this, and I've seen it done so many times so beautifully, and it's simple, so it's a great example of mutualism. We often share our learning objectives or learning outcomes with students in the early days of a class. Invite them and create space for them to set their own learning goals. This is very simple. You could spend 15 minutes on it, and I have found it to be really powerful. If to the extent possible, you can revisit those learning goals regularly. That will be a beautiful application of this principle. When people experience trauma, they lose that sense of agency. So whenever we can invite people back into that agency, it's a deeply healing choice, right? I want to know what you want to get out of this class, right? Rather than telling you what I want you to get out of it. So go ahead and share in the chat if you haven't already. What are some ways you practice collaboration? Oh, Alice Ann, thank you. Thank you. I have a note somewhere that y'all are doing. You have a theme. Let's see if I can find it here. My notes went a little off. Teaching and learning together is your professional development theme. So this is probably resonating with you around that theme. Okay. Empowerment, voice, and choice. I've got a one of many book recommendations in the speaker's notes for you all, a book by the wonderful Tesha Fitzgerald called Anti-Racism and Universal Design for Learning. A lot of you have heard of UDL, Universal Design for Learning. I love Tesha's approach to it, so check that out if you're interested. Okay, how can you apply this to yourselves? I like to remind myself that speaking up, raising my hand, I see that differently, is self-care, it's community care. And even if I think that person that I'm speaking up to is not going to hear me and has no interest in engaging with me on that topic, I find that using my voice is good for me. So speaking up to the extent possible is a trauma-aware teaching practice. Tesha, in that book I mentioned to you, talks about teaching our students to become expert learners. I'm not going to follow them around and live with them for the rest of their lives and go off into their future with them, right? I want them to be empowered to make these choices by themselves. I want them to know how to face any learning challenge and come up with a plan and prepare for it and navigate it. So I love that idea that Tesha shares of helping students become expert learners. Whenever possible, we can do this by giving students choices on assignments. And this does not have to be 10 choices, folks. Maybe it's 2 choices, okay? We're not overdoing anything here. If you can't give a choice on the assignment type, for example, exam, project, paper, perhaps you can give some choice on a topic. I teach research, and the students have a few suggested research topics, intro to research first-year students, or they can come up with their own. So I've given them some choice in that assignment. Don't over-choice them, right? So anybody have this experience where you come across so many choices? Like if I rarely go out to eat, but when I do anymore, it's like, oh my gosh, this is actually stressing me out, right? Just, give me the chicken fingers. So don't over choice our students. So sometimes 2 choices can be better than 10. And we always want to give like a clear path. So some students don't want to make the choice. Just tell me what to do, right? Your choices are stressing me out, Professor Costa. Just give me the clear path. So I like to give students a clear path and say, this is the most typical option that many people will choose, or you can do this and this. So think and share in the chat. I see lots of wonderful comments here about how you are already creating space for empowerment, voice, and choice. And this is our last of the 6 trauma-aware teaching practices, applying a cultural, historical, and gender lens. The trauma-informed care folks added this the past few years, and we see how important this is and that it was a missing piece. So I am sure we have folks from a wide range of identities and relative privileges in the space now. Reflecting for a minute about how that's impacting your teaching, your access to faculty development, your access to faculty support, and perhaps finding that I talked earlier about critical connections. We want to invest in people that we trust and that support us. So maybe today it's about, or this term, it's about finding that one other person who you can show up with as your whole authentic self and connect on this level to get some support here. With our students, we can apply, and with ourselves, a strengths-based, challenge-aware framework. So I do not talk about deficits. I do not think in terms of deficits. My students all have strengths, and I'm aware of their challenges, and I support them from that framework. Considering our own positionality, a lot of folks are sharing positionality statements in a syllabi. That's a great choice to do. Noticing where we need to speak up and where we need to shut up, where we need to learn and where we need to act is one of the ways we can apply this lens. I love inviting my students to bring their wonderful, gorgeous identities into the classroom. One of the easiest ways to do this is to give them choices on assignments, and they will naturally bring their wonderful, rich, vast, diverse identities into your classroom. When we tell them what the assignment has to be, though, we cut them off from that. When we open it up and invite them to do that, it's not like something we need to do the work to do. We're just creating space for students who want and long to do that. So I'll invite you all in the chat to think about how you apply this lens, this trauma-aware teaching strategy into your classes. And I've got one more slide here. I told Mike I would give him a heads up, and it's 12 o'clock, so I'm not mad at myself. I want to circle us back. So I just gave you a lot of information. And the goal here is not to give you 100 more things to do. I would actually be thrilled if you emailed me and said, Karen, after your presentation, I realized I'm going to do some, take something off my plate, right? This is about being more intentional and being more aware. So I want to invite you all. We can't teach well when we are unwell, right? So to whatever extent possible, I'm really right now, folks, talking to myself. I'm really right now talking to myself. Let's put first things first. For me, it's sleep, it's exercise, it's recovery meetings, it's petting my dog. I know those first things. I really think we all do. And it's committing to ourselves and each other that we're going to do those, because I want to be around to do this work and to support you all and to support our students for the long haul. We're seeing an epidemic of burnout. We're seeing an epidemic of trauma and stress in educators and in our students. And one of the antidotes to this is to keep talking about taking care of each other and taking care of ourselves. Okay. First things first. So we are going to